Welcome to Homeschool Your Way. My name is Jana Cook, your host and Bookshark's community manager. In today's episode, I am joined with author Nancy Jo Wilson. We're going to be talking about how you can awaken imagination and your children through reading and writing. Nancy Jo, thank you so much for being here.
I am so happy and excited to be here and talk with everyone.
So, Nancy, let's start right away with how did you end up in the homeschool realm?
Okay, I always knew I wanted to stay at home with my kids. But of course, I went to college and I ended up majoring in biology education. And I remember even then thinking, wait, they're certifying me to teach other people's kids. Does that mean I can teach my kids? Like, I didn't even know that there was a thing called homeschooling, but I already had that thought process of, why do I only get to stay at home with them for 5 years? If I'm an educator, why can't I also be their teacher? And then later, when I heard what homeschooling was, I was like, yes, I didn't even have kids yet, and when all my friends were done with their curriculum, I was putting it in my walk-in closet. And, my poor son was like 1 year old and I had all these books that I was hoarding, let's be honest, waiting till I could finally, homeschool him. Yeah.
So, how many children do you have?
I have two, but they are 13 years apart. So I've homeschooled them both all the way through. So I homeschooled one all the way through and graduated him and then started over. And my second son is in 6th grade.
I'm not sure if that's the most beautiful story or the most horrifying story I've ever heard.
I like it, because we got to push off the empty nest for another, couple decades. So no, it's wonderful. Having a little boy in the house when we're a little older, it's good. It brings us energy in life. That's what I think.
Yeah. What a unique perspective, though, because you kind of have an idea of how you did it the first time. And
Mm.
then the second time around, are you aware? Like, I did it this way last time. I'm going to try it differently this time.
Well, okay, but you having three children, no, they're all different kids, you know. So I was thinking, just as a small example, I'm thinking, I've got it made. I have this kid who's in 9th grade, and I have the second one. I know about homeschooling, I know about parenting, and just a small thing, but my second child, if you read my blog, I call him Peck. Peck is left-handed. So right there, it's a small thing, but I didn't know how to teach a left-handed child to write. So there's always an adventure. I don't think that you've ever arrived, because they're going to come up with something different that you have to figure out. And that's what keeps it fun and challenging.
Yeah, I know a lot of people are surprised when I talk about my twins and how opposite they are. And I'm like, why do you expect just because they were born on the same day, the
Yeah.
same gender, that
Mhm.
they would have the same personality? And they are not at all. And then I think bringing in a third
Yeah.
variable into the equation. My
Right.
husband tried to tell me it wasn't a good idea, but I just had to push.
Well, I think, though, that's the fabulous thing about homeschooling, that you can kind of, you know, create things for each individual personality, and you have room to do that. And you're not trying to manage or fit them into a cookie cutter mold. You can allow them to be them and kind of mold things toward the way they are.
Well, what about a homeschool hack? What do you have that you can share with our families?
I thought a lot about this, and I actually thought about, make sure you take time to relationship build, because, as a parent, you're disciplining and correcting all the time. And as an educator, you're correcting all the time. And you want to make sure that you take time during the week to just be a parent and a child, enjoying each other's company with no stress or pressure. With my boys, we always have TV shows we enjoy watching together. So like at lunch break, we would eat and watch our show and talk about our show. But it doesn't have to be that. It could be sports. It could be, whatever. But just make sure that each week you have time where you're not the grand corrector and they're not feeling like everything they're doing is under observation or has to be a certain way. And y'all can just be.
I like that. I like that idea. Maybe we could hashtag it relationship over results.
Mhm. Yes, exactly. Yeah, I agree.
And as they age, you find when they become teenagers and young adults, that's becomes even more important.
Yes, and I would advise a lot, if you want them to talk to you when they're teenagers, you better have already been talking to them when they're younger. They
Mhm.
need, because if you haven't had that relationship and then all of a sudden they're teens and they're like, tell me what's going on in their life, your life, that's just weird to them, but if you've always had that relationship with, and that means sitting down and listening to lots of conversations about Pokemon, which is not my thing, but it shows, you know what, I'm interested in what you're interested in, so that when they're in and they're 16 and 17 and they're starting to reach that phase where they're figuring things out, they still know they could talk to you about anything because they could when they were little.
And I think that relationship building is another opportunity to talk about this idea of awakening the imagination
Yes,
because
I
we
agree.
are so quick to, hold our babies and our toddlers and open up those board books and really get so excited when they ask those questions and we're like, "Oh my gosh, yes, you're amazing.
Yes.
You're going to be an Einstein. I know it for sure."
Yeah.
And then I find that not necessarily in the homeschool realm. It just kind of depends on your community,
Mhm.
but we start to read less and less. Children learn how to read on their own. So then we kind of
Yes.
say, okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to read that so that I can then go do this. And that might be out of
Mhm.
necessity because you are homeschooling more than one child,
Right.
multiple levels. I mean, there's so many reasons why, but I think that one of the reasons that as homeschoolers, we
Mhm.
continue to push this idea of literature based homeschooling because we do
Yes.
understand the importance of not only being read to, and I
Mhm.
encourage parents to not stop at a certain age.
Right.
I know my 13-year-old is semi resistant, and so we kind of go back and forth on how much I read to her,
Mhm.
and part of that might just be because I'm not as available as she would like me to be. So she's out of that. But we know that when we read to our kids, we are awakening their imagination. If I say,
Yes.
the truck drove down the road, what you're envisioning about what type of truck,
Mhm.
what scenery, what type of road, I mean, all of
Right.
that is building and awakening the imagination. But what I think in my situation I've seen is a slight disconnect is I don't think we perceive that writing can be
Mhm.
just as awakening because
Yes,
it's a harder task or maybe not
it
harder,
is.
but what do you think?
No, I agree. I was thinking about this and I was like, okay, so people are going to ask, why is an awakening imagination even important? Why does it matter? But when we're educating our children, we are trying to mature their entire brain, not just a part of their brain. So just like when you work out your body, you don't just work your arms if you work out. This if but you don't just work your arms, you work everything, and the brain is the same way. Even if you have a super analytical child, you should still make the effort to wake up their imagination because that matures their entire brain. So as much as you can, try to bring that in. So when we're talking about writing, even if it's formal writing, let them choose a topic that they're passionate about. Because when they choose something that they're interested in, it awakens their mind, it awakens their imagination. Um, I know a young lady who was in a writing class of mine, total girly girl, beautiful, always in these outfits, but she's in love with Formula One racing. And so when you talk about formula racing, you can see in her head, she's imagining what the cars look like and what they're doing and what the pit crew's doing, and it's all right there. So I think part of the trick for the parent is to find out what they're passionate about and then direct them toward that, because the more interested they are in the subject, the more their mind is just going to light up and imagine and see all these different scenarios on that topic.
And you and I had talked before that for the children who maybe haven't exercised this muscle as much, and we ask them to be imaginative, that's overwhelming.
It is. I told you the example, my son, we watched Encanto, and I thought, oh, this, because he loved the movie, I thought this will be great. If you haven't seen the movie, the people inherit specific kind of gifts or powers, and then the house itself creates them a room that has to do with their gifts or powers. And so I was like, oh, this is awesome. And I was like, okay, you decide what your Encanto power would be and then design your bedroom. I had no idea, but it completely stressed him out. He was like, well, what do you think my power would be? What powers do you think? I mean, just trying to decide on a power was hard. He has a very linear analytical mind. So trying to pick a power out of thin air was difficult for him. And the thing is, I've been doing this homeschooling for over 20 years. I know this, but for some reason I didn't engage it. What I should have said was choose one of these three powers to be yours, and taking into account what I know about him as a personality, right? Choose one of these three that kind of fit with him, and then design your room. So then I've narrowed the field down and he's just picking one of these three instead of trying to come up with something out of thin air. Because an analytical child needs a germ or a crumb to build on. Whereas an incredibly creative child, you usually have to rein them in, like, no, we're not going to Lowe's to buy the wood so you can actually build the room. You can draw it, it's fine, but your more analytical child, you've got to kind of teach them. I remember when he was little, I kind of had to teach him sometimes how to pretend, you know, because he just needed that germ of idea. Oh, these are the Power Rangers. Who are they battling? Like I had to give him that little bit of, but then once I did, his imagination took off. So sometimes it helps to just give them options and then they can go from there.
I also think as homeschool parents, when we have very specific curriculum that we're using and we feel comfortable with, I mean, I've used Bookshark. I'm in my 7th year. I have not
Yeah,
deviated. It works really well for us, and
right.
it's literature based. So I'm loving that we read, because that's my jam, right? Like, let's
Right.
read. We can talk about it. I remember telling my college professor, like, can't we just talk about it? Do I have to put it on a paper? Like, I would much rather chat with you about it. So when I tell people I'm living my dream because I get paid to talk, it is the absolute truth.
Yeah.
But when we read these assignments or lessons, and sometimes we don't feel even ourselves the freedom to be creative and
Yeah.
imaginative with these lessons. And so I know in the past I have really hindered my children
Mhm.
by sticking to, this is what it says to do, we are going to do it. Now, granted, that is important, and where children need
Yes.
to learn to follow directions, and these are the rules. But the whole point of us
Mhm.
homeschooling is to individualize our children's education.
Yes. I'm eclectic. I change my curriculum except for math, you see, from year to year because I get bored with it. My poor kid. Um, but he has some curriculum that it's just workbook based curriculum and it's just da 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 do this. So what I do to kind of bring that imagination into it is I do 4 days a week of academic school and then 1 day a week where we do more hands-on creative things. So like he's about to be starting reading about the ancient civilizations. And I do research online. I don't necessarily come up with everything myself, but I might Google the ancient ages and wait for something to hit me with a spark. And then I'll be like, oh, we could try to make one of those statues out of clay. You know, so sometimes when I have something that's super set, I still try to look at it and go, okay, how can I bring reading and writing into this? Let me go find a book. Let me go think of a creative writing project we can do on top of it. But then you have to keep in mind that sometimes you don't want to overwork your kids. So that means you might drop one of the set assignments. It's okay. It's okay to do that. You don't have to do everything they say. Although I'm talking to the book shark person and you'll probably go, well, we spend a lot of time, but you don't have to, if there is a style of assignment they've got that is not clicking with your kid, it's okay to skip that section and search for something else. And it's okay to go, we read this book. Now write a paragraph from the point of view of the dog in that book or something like that, putting a creative spin on it, even if it's a set followed thing, is my thought.
Well, and we even encourage parents by saying, we give you an instructor's guide. It is not a dictator. It is there to
Right.
help you feel safe and keep you on a path if that path is working for you. But we are trying to help a parent do the things that we know help children grow and educate
Mhm.
them, but it is not, if you miss this day, you have wrecked your children and you just give up now because it's over with.
Yes. The other thing, because we're talking about imagination, I realized I kind of wanted to define that. When I say, because I think you say imagination, and most people think that their kids should be dreaming up worlds with mermaids and sea dragons and that kind of thing. But I believe fully that every child has imagination. Even if you have an analytical child, when they're little, they're still pretending the Hot Wheels car is driving down the road. Okay, so they might not be pretending it's driving on Mars, but they're still pretending. And when you expand that imagination, so you may have a child who loves math and you may go, well, there's no imagination in there. But when they sit down and develop a database, there's imagination in there. They're kind of having to dream up and think about how to move and how to let their brain kind of explore to create that. So they're still using imagination. It's not as flashy as somebody else, but they're still using their imagination, which is why you need to foster it, why you need to stretch them outside their comfort zone and challenge them. Because if you think about it, every invention started in someone's imagination. They were sitting back going, how do I solve this? And they mentally started to get a picture of what may be solved. Well, that's still imagination. And that's why you want to try and foster it in your children, even if you have a very analytical one. It's in there. Just find out where it is and encourage it. If they're all about dinosaurs, there is literally nothing wrong with all year, every short story they write being about a dinosaur, every book they read being about a dinosaur. If that's what's getting it for them, it is going to make their imagination go.
And I think we discount that every innovation that
Mhm.
we come across, every advancement in science and technology, you're right, it's all imagination. Problem
Right.
solving in and of itself is
Yes, it
imagination.
is.
And so
Yes.
if you have a child that they just don't like writing, they're not really into reading, you're actually doing them a disservice because the atrophy in that side of the brain
Mhm.
that
I
is
agree.
happening when you go, oh, but they're really good in science, they're really good in math. Well, actually, those two subjects need imagination.
They do. They absolutely need imagination. I do have tricks if you have reluctant readers. One thing that, because my boys were good readers, but they didn't enjoy sitting down to read a book. And I think it was just because they're not into sitting still. you know, they'd rather be, my older son, Tech, I mean, he's still at 25, rarely just walks through a room. He usually like combat dives through a room. It's just, they're not sitters. And so I think that's why reading's not their favorite thing. But one of the tricks is, okay, bedtime is 9, but if you're reading, you can stay up till 9:30.
Mhm.
Another thing I do in school is what I call free reading. There's the books we're reading for school that we usually do read aloud, but then there's free reading. They can pick whatever book they want to read and read whatever they want to read during free reading. And but the trick is, if you're going to put that out there, you need to have the books available. Whether you stay on top of and are already check out a wide variety of books so they can kind of find what they like. Or I'm library challenged. No matter how many reminder notes, no matter what I write on my calendar, I'm always late. So I don't do the library. I instead, if I'm in a thrift store or a store with a bargain bin, I've even found them in antique stores, I'll go searching for cheap books. And then I just have them available. So when he's free reading, or, he's only allowed electronics certain times of the day, and he'll come to me and go, I'm bored. By the way, imagination grows in boredom. They
Hmm.
need to have times where they're bored, because then as they, start to entertain themselves, it's building their imagination. But so if he's bored, I'm like, go read a book. And then there's plenty, and he can pick one. And even cartoon books, my older son, I had to start with like Foxtrot and Calvin and Hobbes and Garfield during his free read. That was the only thing he was going to read. But by having those available, and then you kind of hit on what they like, but you need the resources there if you're going to take those kinds of actions.
I recall there was a time in one of my daughter's lives that she really was getting into, I thought, comic books. I was corrected. They are graphic novels.
Well,
And I
yes.
remember going to the librarian and saying, am I doing her a disservice? Because this is really all that she's into right now. And she said, we have college professors that come in and all they do is they sit here and they read graphic novels. She was like, your child is reading. She's enjoying it. She's engaged. And I said, okay, and never again. And then I started reading some graphic novels. I found classics that were then turned into graphic novels, or vice versa. I'm assuming if it's a
Right.
classic, probably that way. But I was amazed how much I did enjoy it. Now, granted, I had read the classic first, so I knew
Right.
where some of the lack of word count they would
Mhm.
make up in the picture that you were looking at,
Right.
which I thought was just amazing. So that is another hack. Like, look at
Mhm.
graphic novels or comic books for your
Yes.
kids.
I think those work very well with reluctant readers because there's not as many words they have to struggle with. But at the same time, they still have these elaborate pictures that help them build a world in their head and really wake up that imagination. Even if it's not as many words, they're still getting also that just effect of, let me picture this in my head and what's going on and all of that. Yeah. My my younger son reads graphic novels. So
Another thing that I have seen some of instructors that my girls have been under over the years, this idea of taking a classic fairy tale and twisting it, right? So
yes.
you're within the bounds. So for someone who is like, that linear thinker, like, I couldn't possibly come up with a new fairy tale. Why should I,
Mhm.
anyways? We already have some good ones. Take a story you already know
Right.
and twist it up. And sometimes
Yes,
I know
that's
my
an
girls would
excellent.
come to me and I'd be like, you didn't really change a whole lot, bad on me. Looking back, I could have just encouraged a little bit differently. But
Right.
um, same thing with the graphic novel. The story ends. Well, can you add to the story? Can you give a story a different ending? It's little ways that we can tweak the
Yes.
reading and the
Yes.
writing so it's not overwhelming. A lot of times kids will say, I'm bored or this is dumb. It's not necessarily that they don't want to do it, they don't know how to do it.
They don't know how. It's true. They don't know how to come from, and that was a hard thing for me to learn. One thing as parents is especially when we're homeschooling, to realize that your kids don't necessarily learn the way that you learned or think the way that you think. And as I said, I had biology education degree, and I taught in the public school for a year, and I taught in private school for a year, and I've taught in a ton of co-ops. And me being an incredibly creative person, it was hard for me to understand that people don't just sit around all day dreaming up worlds and making up new vocabulary for things. So I had to kind of sit back and go, okay, not everybody thinks like me. How do I spark that in my children? And you brought up the word innovation, which I thought was interesting, because Tech, my older son, is very creative. I say that Peck is innovative. He's very innovative, but to me, innovation is taking something and using it in a different way than it was used before. Whereas being creative, you're just dreaming it up out of nothing. But innovation, there's this concept and then you're modifying it. And my son is incredibly innovative. But I had to realize that means I have to give him that initial thing that he can then modify. Like you said, change the fairy tale, or if there's a book they've really liked, you know, tell them to change something about that. What's something you would have liked better, and write that paragraph. A writing assignment that I have found every kid always likes is write a story from the point of view of an inanimate object, like a lamp. What's a day in the life of a lamp like? What is the lamp thinking about? What is it, but give them that idea, that story prompt or that concept, and they can usually run with it, but you do have to give them that germ. Yeah.
Another great option, and I don't know if you had these around when you were a kid, but my mom used to read to us the choose your own adventure books. So you're at a fork in the road. Your main character has to make a choice, and then you get to decide the fate of your character. And
Yes.
then if it doesn't, you're like, oh, I didn't really like how that turned out, or let's see how it turns out if he chooses differently. And so then you
Right.
go back and you go to the opposite choice that you had him made. And as you're working through that, I think, why can't we do that with our kids and different writing assignments? Like, hey, this is the choice that he made in the story that you're reading or they're asking you to write about. But what
Right.
if you just go in and you have him make the opposite choice? What road does that lead him down? Where can he be? And again, we have children who just aren't necessarily what we think as
Right.
imaginative. But if we give them a box that has enough tools in it, anyone can
Yes,
be
I agree.
imaginative.
I agree with that 100%. That's a great way to describe it, a box with enough tools. Another thing that I have used is there's a product called Story Cubes. There might also be knockoff kind of things, but they're literally like big dice with different pictures on them, people, the sunshine, whatever, and you roll them and then you try to make a story out of the pictures that appear. That's also a fun thing to do because, again, the germ is given, but where do you take it once it's out there? You know.
And with all of our technology, you have a child who maybe can't write down everything that they want. You can take that idea of the story and the pictures in the story, have them record themselves, and then
Yes.
you write it down. And then when you read it at dinner and say, listen to the story that Johnny created today. And even he's going to be like, that was my story. Because, so many
Yes.
times my youngest will just throw out these words that I'm like, that was a big word. That's a complicated word. Like, I'm not going
Yeah.
to ask you to spell it. I'm not going to spell it because I probably couldn't, but she uses it in the correct context.
Yeah.
And a lot of times when children go to write, they do have an idea of what they want to say,
Hmm.
but the translation, it gets stuck in translation. So dictation
Right.
is a huge hack for
Yes.
helping kids be imaginative in their writing.
And beyond that, sometimes pretending or acting out is a good precursor to writing because they're learning how to make but my son has many times um, made the scene out of Legos and then acted it out with two Lego figures. That's a similar thing. They're dictating, they're speaking it out, they're thinking it through. And also, a family with a lot of children, well, you can have the children act out the scene together or write the story together or tell a story together. Um, and that's just a hack of not everything has to be each individual child. There are some things they can do as a group. So you're not coming up with, say, 7 different lessons. You can have the whole group do something and it's handling it all.
That's right. You have group collaboration, you have give
That's
and
right.
take, you have so many skills that can be learned in working through that.
Hmm.
I do find it slightly ironic, although I shouldn't, that your youngest son, Peck, is innovative when you are very creative. I want to just tell you guys a little bit.
Oh.
Nancy Joe is an author. Not only do you author some fiction, science fiction,
Yes.
clean
Clean science fiction. Yeah.
novels. You also have some nonfiction workbooks that you have created. So why don't you tell us a
Right.
little bit about that?
I have the one that applies to what we're talking about here, generic literature guide. And if you remember generic food from when we were young, the labels were black and white, and that's why I made like this very nondescript book. But my sister and I, because she has an English degree and I'm a writer, we've always been very comfortable with let your children read what they want to read. I mean, now I adore the classics. That was never an issue for me, but neither of my boys wanted to read like the assigned books that came with curriculum. That was not their thing. And so I would just let them read whatever they wanted to read, because I could then sit down and talk about literary concepts with them. What is let's discuss the protagonist, the antagonist, all those fancy words. And but she and I realized that not every parent has the degrees we have and the abilities that we have. So we decided to write a book. This is a resource. It is not a curriculum. It is supposed to be a resource to help parents let their kid read whatever they want to read, even if it's a graphic novel, and then know these are the things we can talk about. So it's laid out. There's worksheets in. You can make as many copies as you want, but so there are worksheets for chapter summary, but it's laid out. You've got a worksheet filled out with examples, and then of course we have the blank worksheet. So whatever your child is reading, you can still go, okay, let's talk about simile and metaphors, because all of those components are in a book. I mean, here's one we used in writing this book. It's a Black Panther book. There's all kinds of literary devices in here, onomatopoeia, there's conflict, there's theme. All of that is in this book. And your child might want to read this, but then you're like, okay, so how do we talk about it? And we also wrote it with the intention that you could use it all the way from kindergarten through high school. We have a section in there saying, if you've got a kindergartner, just focus on setting or just focus on this. And then if you want, you could just hand the whole thing to your high school student and they can fill it out as they're reading their book. So you can also adjust it based on age level. But really, our desire is always to equip homeschoolers to succeed. Always. This is why I loved going to conventions, because I absolutely love having those conversations at the table. They can say, this is the trouble I'm having with my student, whether it's reading related or not. I'll talk about math. This is what worked for me, but just the desire to equip you to do what you can. So if you have a child that really would benefit from reading what they want to read, that's what's going to spark their imagination, then you can still find educational value. And that's really the important part.
And as a comfort to parents, I homeschooled 8th through 12th grade. I was able to go to college. I didn't read a lot of the classics when I was going through my homeschool. I will tell you now that every year I read 1 or 2 classics, because at this point in my life, I want to do that. I'm excited to do that. And then I have to find some high school seniors that will talk with me about it, because
right.
If I can find someone that actually read the book. But
right.
Even, in book clubs, it's like we have this desire that I think some people are worried, if we get away from the classics, that we're going to lose that sense of conservatism and wonder of what has gone before us. But I would argue that if you allow your children to read what they're comfortable with, what engages them, on their own. I mean, I obviously very much believe in reading living history and all of
I
those
do
good
too.
things as you work through curriculum. But I promise, if they have the love of learning and reading, they will come back around to it. And now there's
Right.
so many books that are a twist on the classics. I know my
Right.
twins, they go to the bookstore with their friends and they buy each other books at Christmas and birthdays. And I mean, I don't know that these were
That is
kids that
beautiful.
were like so excited, you know?
Sorry, I was like, oh, that makes a writer happy.
Well, Nancy Joe, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be on this episode and encourage parents on just ways to be awakening the imagination in their children. Thank you for sharing the stories of your sons. I would write them a thank you note as well.
I have really enjoyed being here, and I appreciate you asking me to be here because I think exploring imagination and igniting imagination is just incredibly important for really having a rounded education. Just like the arts and music are also important because you're developing, and it doesn't mean your kid's going to be good at all of them. You know, they may be terrible, but the fact that they're trying still works that and develops that and wakes it up. And I just think it's so important. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it.
Nancy Jo, where could we find your blogs? What would be a place that a listener could go to?
Okay, my blog is 65mom.com, and I blog about homeschool and like homemaking stuff on Fridays. I post lesson ideas, I talk about our schedules. Sometimes I'm posting crafts, but that would be the day they come and find out homeschool stuff and good poems to read, good books to read. I kind of cover the gambit on Fridays.
So once again, thank you. Thank you
Thank
guys for
you.
listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.